The dusty town of Dry Creek lay silent under the weight of the midday sun. Wooden storefronts lined the single street that ran through the settlement, their weathered signs creaking faintly in the dry wind. The saloon doors hung slightly ajar, the faint tinkling of a piano drifting out only to be swallowed by the desert air. Few dared to step into the open at that hour, for the desert heat was merciless. But silence was not only born of weather, it was also born of fear. At the center of the street, all eyes were fixed on a single sight: a woman, worn and trembling, perched atop a rough wooden table. Her plain gray dress bore stains of dust and hardship, and in her arms she clutched a newborn, swaddled in faded cloth. Strands of dark hair clung to her damp cheeks as she bent over the child protectively, whispering words only the baby could hear. Her lips trembled, but her arms never loosened. Before her stood a man in a long coat, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his stern, weathered face. His boots had left heavy imprints in the dirt, and his hand rested near the iron weight of his revolver, though not out of threat, out of habit. In his other hand, he held a small pile of silver coins, gleaming faintly in the harsh light. His eyes were fixed on the woman, steady but conflicted, as though he were weighing something far heavier than the money in his palm. Behind him, 3 men loitered like shadows, guns strapped to their hips, their stances rigid and watchful. They were not strangers to violence, their posture told of years spent standing behind a man who commanded fear. And yet, even they glanced uneasily between the woman and their leader, unsure of the business unfolding. Her name was Clara Mayfield. Once, she had been the daughter of a rancher whose small herd grazed on the edges of the desert plains. But when drought struck, the Mayfield ranch withered, its livestock perished, and the family fell into ruin. Clara's father died broken-hearted, her mother succumbed to fever soon after, and Clara was left with nothing but the shell of a home and a world that offered no kindness to the poor. Now she was a mother herself. The child in her arms, no more than a few weeks old, whimpered faintly in the sweltering heat. Clara pressed her lips to the child's forehead, tears mingling with the dust, as though the weight of the world pressed on her frail shoulders. She was on her knees not out of choice, but out of desperation. The man before her was Marshal Elias Crowe, a name that carried both authority and dread in Dry Creek. Once, he had been hailed as the lawman who tamed the border towns, the one who kept chaos at bay with his 6-shooter and cold, steady resolve. But time and violence had eroded the man he once was, leaving behind someone whose justice was tangled with shadows. Rumors whispered that Crowe had become less of a protector and more of a dealer in debts, both money and lives. If you wanted safety, you paid him. If you broke his word, you vanished. And if you had nothing to offer, your fate was your own. Clara had dared to approach him, not for herself, but for the child she carried. Hunger gnawed at them both, and the dry wind had turned her milk to nothing. She had no family left, no home, no means to survive. All she had was her pride, and the two she was ready to sacrifice if it meant her baby would live. So, with trembling hands, she had carried her child into the heart of Dry Creek and laid her plea at Marshal Crowe's feet. Now, silence stretched between them as Crowe stared at the infant. His weathered hand opened, the silver coins catching the light like a cruel promise. The onlookers who had gathered at doorways and windows whispered among themselves, watching history repeat itself. This was not the first time a desperate soul had bartered with the marshal. Some had walked away with their dignity in tatters and pockets lined with coin. Others had not walked away at all. "Take it," Crowe said finally, his voice a low rumble that carried across the street. He held out the coins toward Clara, his face unreadable. "It'll buy you food, a roof, and time. That's all a woman can ask for in this town." But Clara did not reach for the silver. Instead, she held her baby closer, her eyes narrowing with defiance even as fear trembled through her. "I didn't come for charity," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking under the strain. "I came for protection, for him." Her gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms, then rose again to meet Crowe's. "I don't care what happens to me. But he deserves a chance. A future." A ripple of murmurs stirred through the gathered townsfolk. Crowe's men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to their leader. It was not often that anyone spoke to Elias Crowe with such boldness. For a moment, the marshal's jaw tightened, the flicker of something, perhaps anger, perhaps respect, passing across his face. Crowe took a slow step closer, his spurs scraping the dirt. He studied the child, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching in its sleep. "You're asking me to guard a life," he said at last, his tone sharp, measured. "A life that ain't mine. Do you understand what that costs? Clara's arms tightened around her child as though shielding him from the weight of the words. Everything, she whispered. I'll give you everything. Just, not him, not my son. The marshal's hand closed around the silver, the coins clinking faintly as he let them drop back into his pocket. His other hand drifted closer to the revolver at his side, not in threat, but in thought. He studied the woman before him, her thin frame trembling, her eyes burning with desperation and defiance. Something in her stirred an echo from his past, a memory buried deep beneath years of blood and dust. Once, long ago, Elias Crowe had known what it meant to protect. He had known the weight of family, the warmth of a child's laughter. But that life had been ripped from him, torn apart by violence and betrayal. Since then, he had buried such memories beneath steel and coin. Yet here, before him, stood a woman who refused to let go of the very thing he had lost. For a long, unbearable moment, the street held its breath. Then Crowe spoke, his voice quieter than before, but no less sharp. You've got 3 days, Clara Mayfield. 3 days to prove that baby deserves the future you're asking me to guard. If you can't, then I'll decide for him. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to protest, but the words died on her lips. All she could do was clutch her baby tighter, her heart pounding like a war drum. The marshal turned on his heel, his coat sweeping dust in his wake, and strode down the street. His men followed, their faces grim. Behind him, Clara collapsed forward, her tears dampening the blanket that wrapped her child. 3 days. That was all she had. And in Dry Creek, 3 days could mean the difference between salvation and ruin. The town of Dry Creek settled back into its uneasy rhythm after Marshal Elias Crowe's declaration, but whispers still trailed like smoke in the air. Word spread faster than fire in brushwood. Clara Mayfield had begged the marshal for protection, and instead of granting mercy, Crowe had given her a test. 3 days, nothing more. For Clara, each hour that followed stretched into an eternity. She wandered through the edges of the town, clutching her child against her chest, feeling the weight of eyes on her wherever she went. Some looked at her with pity, others with scorn. A few muttered that she was a fool for putting herself at Crowe's mercy, that no one bargained with the marshal and came away unscathed. Yet beneath all the gossip lay an undercurrent of fascination. What would come of this challenge? That night, Clara huddled in the corner of a weather-beaten shack at the edge of town. Its walls rattled with every gust of desert wind, and the floor was little more than warped boards, but it offered shelter from the cold night air. She pressed her baby close, whispering lullabies through choked sobs. She had no plan, no allies, and no guarantee that Crowe meant anything more than a cruel jest. But as her child stirred in her arms, she swore to herself that she would not let him be taken. She would fight, beg, crawl, whatever it took. The baby's tiny breaths warmed her chest, and in that fragile rhythm she found strength she did not know she possessed. By morning, Clara began her search for hope in a place where it seemed none could exist. She wandered into the main street again, her bare feet padding silently through the dust. She stopped at the blacksmith's forge, where the heavy clang of hammer against steel rang through the morning air. Thomas, she said softly, approaching the broad-shouldered man at the anvil. I need work, any work. Thomas paused, sweat glistening on his brow as he looked at her, at the bundle she held and the desperation in her eyes. His face softened, but he shook his head slowly. Clara, I've got mouths of my own to feed. I can't afford to hire anyone. Her chest tightened, but she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She moved on. At the saloon, she offered to scrub floors and wash dishes in exchange for scraps of food. The barkeep, a rotund man with a crooked smile, let out a laugh that echoed through the smoky air. With a babe on your hip, you'd be more trouble than you're worth. Best leave this place before Crowe decides what's to be done. Everywhere she turned, doors closed in her face. By sundown, Clara's hope had withered thin. She returned to her shack with nothing but a heel of bread, given to her by a kind old woman who whispered a prayer as she placed it in her hands. Clara split the crust, soaking it in a rag with water to soften it before pressing it to her baby's lips. The infant suckled weakly, and Clara fought back tears of both relief and despair. Meanwhile, Elias Crowe sat in the sheriff's office, staring at the flicker of a lamp on his desk. His deputies lounged nearby, their laughter subdued as they played cards. Yet Crowe was silent, lost in thought. Clara Mayfield's plea haunted him. Her voice, her eyes, Her defiance, it stirred something he had long buried. Once, many years ago, he had a wife named Evelyn, and in her arms had been a daughter with curls like spun gold. But violence had stolen them from him. Bandits had ridden through his land, burning and killing, and when the smoke cleared, Crowe was left with nothing but a graveyard. That was the day he hardened. That was the day the law became less about justice and more about control. But now he saw in Clara a reflection of Evelyn's fire, and in the babe's fragile form, a reminder of what he had lost. He clenched his fist, the weight of silver coins pressing into his palm. 3 days, he had said. Why 3? Perhaps he had wanted to test her resolve. Or perhaps he had wanted to test himself. The second day dawned with a blood-red sky. Clara awoke to the sound of boots crunching outside her shack. Her heart froze as the door creaked open, revealing one of Crowe's men, Jonas, a wiry deputy with a scar down his cheek. "The marshal sent me," Jonas drawled. "Wants to see how you're getting on." Clara tightened her grip on her baby. "Tell him, I'm doing what I can." Jonas smirked, stepping closer. "Ain't much to show for it, far as I can see. Maybe the marshal oughta take that young'un now, save you the trouble." His hand reached out toward the child. "Don't you dare," Clara hissed, drawing back like a cornered animal. Her eyes blazed with a fierceness that startled even Jonas. "You'll have to kill me before you lay a hand on him." For a moment, Jonas faltered. Then he chuckled and stepped back. "Feisty. I'll tell Crowe you're still fighting. But you'd best hurry, woman. The marshal's patience don't last long." He tipped his hat mockingly and left. Clara's body trembled with rage and fear, but she held her baby close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. On the final day, Clara awoke with a clarity she had not known before. She could not rely on charity. She could not wait for mercy. If she wanted her child to have a future, she had to prove it in a way Crowe could not deny. She walked into town as the sun reached its peak, her bare feet coated in dust, her hair loose and tangled. The townsfolk watched in silence as she climbed onto the same table where she had knelt before. She held her baby high, her voice carrying across the street with surprising strength. 3 days, Marshal Crowe, she called out. "You gave me 3 days. And I've spent every one of them searching for a way to keep him alive. The truth is, I've found no work, no kindness, and no home. This town has nothing left to give. But I will not," her voice cracked, but she pressed on, "I will not surrender my son to despair. If you mean to take him, you'll have to take me too." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Crowe emerged from the shadows, his coat swaying as he strode forward. He stopped before her once more, the street holding its breath. His eyes met hers, sharp, unwavering, yet softened by something only he could understand. Slowly, he reached into his coat and drew out not his gun, but the pouch of silver coins. He held them out, not to buy her silence, but as an offering. "You've got fire," he said quietly. "Same fire my Evelyn once had. That boy of yours, he'll need it. He'll need more than silver and more than pity. He'll need a mother who won't yield, no matter the cost." Clara's lips trembled, but she did not lower her gaze. "Then give me the chance. Not the charity, the chance." Crowe's jaw tightened. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of judgment and redemption alike, he declared. "You'll have it. From this day on, no harm will touch that child so long as Elias Crowe draws breath." The crowd erupted in murmurs of shock. The marshal, who had never bent to anyone, had just pledged protection to a destitute woman and her son. Clara's knees buckled, and she sank to the table, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her baby. Relief washed over her, but so too did fear, for she knew that pledges came with prices. Crowe turned to his men, his voice iron. "Anyone who lays a hand on Clara Mayfield or her child will answer to me." And with that, the balance of Dry Creek shifted. Some said Crowe had grown weak. Others said he had remembered the man he once was. But for Clara, none of that mattered. What mattered was the fragile heartbeat against her chest and the promise that, for the first time since his birth, her child had a chance to live. And though the desert winds still howled, and though shadows still lingered in Dry Creek, Clara walked away that day knowing she had won more than silver, more than protection. She had won the future.